Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whatever part of the world you're joining us from, welcome. Welcome to AI Diet World 2021, Day 3, Solutions Hack. Woohoo! We have heard some great speakers on Day 1 and Day 2, and we have a fabulous lineup of speakers in store for you today. Let me give you a quick overview of what you're going to see today. Here's our agenda for today. We'll kick off the conference with a keynote from Mahesh Mohan Thakur. He is the VP of Product and GM at GoDaddy, and he's going to be keynoting on why board directors and CXOs must become data and AI driven to deliver impact. At 10:30, we are going to hear about sources of truth in a dangerous world from Golda Velez, Director of Raise the Voices and CEO of What's Cooking. At 10:50 a.m., we'll have a panel discussion on bias in AI and how realistic are the mitigation strategies of today. We'll have our own team moderator, Susanna Raj from the DataEthics4All Leadership Council, as well as panelists, Professor Michael Widbrock from University of Auckland and Rolka Krishnan, CTO and co-founder of Ethic AI. At 11:20, we'll hear from George Polisner, CEO at Civic Works, and he's going to talk about a social network as a public utility. At 11:50 a.m., we are going to hear from Alberto Roldan, founder and owner of Artificial Intelligence and Business Analytics Group, about artificial intelligence vibrations. And at 12:10, Dia Wynn, Senior Practice Manager at AWS, will talk about how to accelerate AI adoption. And by 12:30, it'll be a wrap. So join us today. We have an action-packed, fun day for you with great speakers, starting with Mahesh Mohan Thakur from GoDaddy. Let me introduce him, and then we'll bring him on stage. Mahesh Mohan Thakur is a technology executive, a board member, and a CEO advisor with 20 plus years of experience building and scaling teams at Microsoft, Amazon, Intuit, Intel, and even a startup. Mahesh is a guest lecturer at Columbia and NYU. He has hired, coached, and transformed executives and teams at some of the world's fastest growing companies. Please welcome, put your hands together to welcome Mahesh Thakur. Woohoo! Hey Mahesh, good morning.
Good morning, Shilpi. What a pleasure and an honor to be here with you and the folks here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mahesh. Stage is all yours. I'm so excited to hear about, with so much of your experience, I'm excited to hear how CXOs can adopt AI and deliver impact. Go for it.
Excellent. Absolutely. Thank you. I'm happy to chat with you folks about it. I'm just getting my screen to be shared here in a second. Give me one moment. Can you guys see my screen?
Now they can, Mahesh. I've added it to the stage.
Okay, awesome. So I'll get started, assuming the video, audio, and the slides all go together. So I'm excited to speak here today on how AI-driven CEOs and board members can truly deliver impact in today's day and age. I'll be sharing broadly 3 mantras for the board and for the CEOs. The 3 mantras are as follows: to simplify, fail and fail fast, and lastly, the goodness factor. And I'm talking about, how in today's day and age, there are several companies, the landscape is very broad. You think about the landscape, there are traditional companies which are 100 to 200 years old, and there are these startups which are being born today, which are called digital first, or in some cases, digital only. So you look at this broad spectrum of companies, and when I get to work with these amazing board members and CXOs in these companies, I can see how they're thinking and their approach may be so different I have analyzed these folks, I have studied how those folks make decisions, and I've helped them in their journey. So today I'm going to unpack a lot of these observations, and also, give you folks some key nuggets on the challenges that I've seen at companies where I've worked, including Microsoft, Intuit. I'll share with you what has worked, what has not worked, and hopefully we'll have some time in the end to answer questions that folks may have here. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to talk first about Simplify. With Simplify, I would love to share something which I keep repeating, and I keep coming across this more and more as I coach more senior folks. I remind them, number one, AI in and of itself cannot be a strategy for the business. AI is not something which you say, okay, my strategy to win this market is let's just implement AI. That's never going to be the right approach, nor is that going to fly with any seasoned board member. The way to approach it is, my goal or my vision is to win this market share or have 50% market share for our line of product, or our goal is to lower the attrition of our customers from 30 to 10%. That's your business strategy. And to do that, you may now want to implement AI. So if you bring in AI to solve a business problem, and when you talk about the approach, that's the right way to think about it. And that's why I continue to articulate and remind folks, just having AI is not going to help you win in business or win your customers. You have to have an understanding of how the technology is going to help you with the business or the business strategy. The next observation or point here is, AI is not a project, but an investment for the long term. What this means is, we don't want to have projects which say, let's start this for a year and see where it goes, or let's monitor this every couple quarters or every quarter and see if we can get to a point. That's always a bad beginning to a good project. What you want to do is, you have to have the long term horizon of what AI, what data, what all these initiatives would do for your company in 2 or 3 years. And yes, you can have measurable milestones for execution. You can have measurable milestones to even measure if you are running the right set of experiments. But just do not expect something transformational to happen in 3 to 6 months from the time you start, because that'll always have the wrong expectations and it'll lead to failure at different levels. And lastly, AI knowledge is not optional. The executives and board members who understand how critical funding for a company is, they also need to understand how AI works, at least the basics. We don't want them to start coding or writing the ML models, but we at least want them to understand how AI works and how it could be applied for their business or to the customers or for customer care, or whichever department they're trying to problem solve for. So understanding and having that clarity is key, and that knowledge is not optional. It's not like I can outsource my entire tech stack or AI strategy to a company and assume that magic is going to happen. Even that doesn't work. So you got to have the knowledge about how things are going to work, how things are evolving, what does that landscape look like, and then work to educate yourself. So that's what the board members and the CXOs constantly need to do, not only to be aware, but also gain the trust and respect of the folks that they are working with, so that everybody who is being invited to work on AI or take the company to the next level in terms of tech advancement, they have the right level of respect, knowing that the board members, knowing that the CXOs understand what in the world are these folks even talking about. And that's a lot of respect and trust that you build in the company and in the community. My next section here is again talking about digital versus traditional. And as I shared, the digital first are the most recent companies where they have an advantage. When they start, it's a more modern tech stack. They already have a lot of data in place. There is instrumentation. But when you look at the traditional companies, they have to do that heavy lifting. They may have to migrate to the cloud. They may have to teach themselves how to build that data stack. They may have to start many of these things from scratch, maybe even do a complete re-platform, if you will. However, when it comes to both these types of companies, there are a few things which are common that both of them have to work. Number one, culture. They have to always make sure the culture is such that you're accepting that there is going to be a culture of testing and learning instead of just doing whatever the C-suite or the board says. The culture is a very critical aspect of making sure technology or even AI advancement happens. The next thing is org design. How do you design the organization? Whether the data organization is centralized or decentralized? How will the data organization work with the platform teams? How will they actually function in a fashion where there is more collaboration and innovation and an agile execution? A lot of that becomes critical as you think about making investments in AI. Both these types of companies also have to define what that true north looks like. What we mean by true north here is truly having an idea about what does it mean when we become successful 1 year out, 3 year out. What is that true north for us? Usually it's a 3 to 5 year big picture, and then you have goals broken down to achieve that true north. But both types of companies need to define that. The next mantra is to fail and fail fast. What that means is it's okay to fail, have that mindset, but do it fast so that you can iterate. Do it fast so that you can learn and apply that learning to the next cycle of experiments or tests or what have you. In this section, I'll talk about how the cultural revolution, which is led by the board, can help you with fail and fail fast. There is a data driven approach that you want to take versus the hippo. The hippo is the highest paid person's opinion. This is what the board told me to do, or this is what my CTO wants to be done. That's usually an approach that companies take. While it may seem comforting in the short term, the long term effects of these approaches usually backfires on everybody, on the technical leads, on the data scientists, on the CTO, everybody involved. So the more you have a data centric or a data driven approach, the better it is for any kind of company you're with. The experimentation approach is something which is where you always start from the hypotheses of saying doing X will lead to Y. You're trying to test and learn, whether it is a marketing department, the product, the engineering, the platform, or even with customer care. Whatever department you're in, you're seeking to run experiments to test and learn how customers, how your own staff responds to changes. When I worked at Microsoft, I ran these large scale experiments as a part of Bing Search. We would run hundreds of parallel experiments with minor tweaks, minor changes in the product experience that we were trying to drive and test for Bing Search. And at that point, we were trying to compete with Google, with Yahoo. These were all big competitors for Microsoft Bing, which was the third search engine trying to come up. And there I literally had the chance to explore the platforms and go into the depth of how do we run these massive tests in a very short duration and then rapidly iterate and innovate. That whole experimentation was a part of my journey when I went to Intuit. At Intuit, I saw Brad Smith, our CEO there, was a champion of experimentation. He would talk about being able to experiment at scale, not only for US QuickBooks Online, but also for global. He shared his examples of how he was, in fact, impressed with some of those experiments and how they were making a meaningful impact, not only to the products, but also to the overall customer life cycle, which is how customers get into the product, how do they use it, how do they retain, how they interact with customer care, that entire spectrum, that entire lifetime journey. At GoDaddy, I saw Aman, our CEO, come from Expedia. And at Expedia, he talked about the massive scale of experiments that the travel giant ran. And Aman, again, coming to GoDaddy, talked a lot and really pushed forward the culture of experimentation and rapid learning. Again, not just tied to engineering or product, but across all business units, across all parts of the business. And what you will see here is that more and more leaders are now starting to believe in the scientific way of learning and evolving products versus just making a blanket investment in a area and hoping that something would come out from it. What I've also observed is many of the companies now don't want to get into projects which may be like multi-year, but not sure what the outcome is. So that's where you want to question and abandon projects which are more than 1 year old or take more than 1 year. And then also you will start to realize that once you bring that cultural revolution top down, you will see that product managers, data scientists, engineers, PGMs, they all come together. They all start to play a role in this whole cultural revolution. So you can truly see people across different disciplines and across different business units come together, collaborate on the overall data infrastructure, data, the ML models, and finally the outcome that is being delivered. When you think about the AI and data committee on the board, Oftentimes folks have known that on the board you will have the audit and finance committee, and these things became even more stronger requirements when a lot of stuff happened in Wall Street. So everybody on the board is meticulous about the flow of money. What you see now starting as a trend is everybody is starting to also get meticulous about the flow and the usage of data, which is good news because people understand that doing this means that they have to identify the goals that AI will help meet. The board is now able to make great bold investments in terms of what does this mean in terms of a multi-year investment, in terms of technology, in terms of resources. And the board also becomes interested in what would that architecture even look like long term, because having that clarity, at least for the CTO and down, is super important. You get a lot of respect and engagement from your senior engineering leaders, engineering managers, and even engineers, because they might be working on a stack which is outdated, but at least when you share what your architecture is going to evolve and look like 3 years from now, they get the hope that this company is invested and is serious about the technology transformation, and they feel motivated to come to work and work towards that transformation. And that inspires confidence, and longer term it also helps with retention of all those folks in the company. And obviously you can look back at your own experiences and you'll know that when the company chooses to invest in what is modern and what is good for the customer, you felt good, the employees feel good, and the morale obviously is so much better. The committee also could play a role in identifying the key elements throughout the product lifecycle. So, as an example, when the customers come on board, what's important is to know if the customers have activated the product. If the customers have been using a SaaS product, as an example, it's important to know how many times in a day or in a week are the customers engaging with the product. If the customers are exiting or leaving the product or churning, it's important to know what's causing, what are the factors. So, those are examples of how key data elements at different journeys at different journey points in the product lifecycle could be captured. So having a clear idea keeps the board and the entire C-suite honest about what's critical and what doesn't need to be tracked. And that also gets into how ethical can you be by gathering data that matters and not everything else that could be but may not be needed for the company, for the product, and for the growth of the company. You have to constantly message how AI can help productivity and address the insecurity that employees may have. One of the fintech companies that we were advising, a fintech bank, we saw that the sales team was growing increasingly insecure because of the AI investments that were being made. And what we did was we actually did an initiative. We ran an educational initiative to share with them how this AI initiative will help them work towards their sales quota. We trained them and then we gamified the whole adoption of AI so that they can see how AI would actually help them convert more customers and help meet their quotas. When they saw that, they moved from being insecure to now being curious. And that's something that we actively did in order to get people to feel more secure. So that's something that the C-suite and the board needs to actively do to make sure the employees are seeing AI as a complement and not as competition. And lastly, you need to share the impact of AI with all the stakeholders involved. Remember, it's not shareholders, but stakeholders. Stakeholders include your employees, your customers, your shareholders, everybody. And you want to make sure they are all aware the goodness that you're delivering or that you plan to deliver so that they feel confident about both the investments that you're making and the resources that you're trying to line up in that direction. Here's an example of goodness factor. This is a third mantra. So here's John Deere, almost a 200-year-old company, still trying to build an all-new platform, putting a new data infrastructure together, and launching this AI-led see and spray machine, which precisely focuses on the weeds in the farms and gets rid of the weed. And this is such a huge productivity boost for the farmers, and it goes a long way. Now, if you try to tell this to your stakeholders, including your employees, this actually elevates their motivation and it makes them feel like we're doing something not just for work, but for the greater good. And I would say that's a unique opportunity that CTOs and even the board has to tell everybody how there is a goodness factor in what we are doing. Here are a few other examples. There's AI Cure, which is actually monitoring the elderly medication and what it does. um, for you. And this is basically helping the elders. If they haven't had their pill on time, it'll give them reminders, it'll warn them, and it'll warn their families or their near and dear ones, so that they are aware about the medication. This is something that folks didn't have humans deployed, but AI can actually do it. And that's where AI comes in to complement and not to compete with any human, because there was no job originally that was there in the first place that AI took away. So there's that goodness factor. And this is a gap which I'm seeing today, which I just listed here. Most recently, this week or this month, what you'll see is the number of jobs open is almost the same as the number of people unemployed. So clearly, there are people who are not wanting to return to work after the pandemic. So the question to ask is, can AI play a role in upgrading or teaching the workforce new skills, so that they not only become motivated but also have an all new way to come back to work, to return to work? That's clearly a gap, but I hope AI comes out and solves this problem, and we continue to add more goodness factors for our society, for the human race. Mindset that is needed for the startups and corporations. The board members and CEOs must gain the knowledge themselves first before they go big or broad. They should approach AI, and whatever they are doing with it, as a long-term strategy, not something which is a quarterly or a one-year initiative. Appoint the CTO, Chief Data Officer, Chief Data Information Officer, whoever is responsible for this. Appoint the right folks who have the technical breadth, the depth. They understand business, and they are the folks who can connect the dots between the business strategy and the tech platform and how to get it done. Because if they have that clarity, they will then command the respect, and they will be able to attract, retain, and work with those talented folks, engineers, data scientists, analysts, who can make this mission happen within the company. Big vision, small bites. With this, what I mean is, you can definitely have a 2 3 year vision, but figure out how you can break this down into quarterly or even monthly milestones, and continue to measure these small bites, continue to measure the outcome, celebrate the successes, and know that you're ultimately headed in the direction of the true north that you have defined. Takeaway: the board humans can bring in AI to complement and not compete, just how we bring in the CEOs and board members to complement with each other. Somebody is good with auditing, somebody is good with executive comp, somebody is good with data AI, somebody is good with cybersecurity. They complement each other to move the company forward in the right direction. Similarly, humans can bring in AI to complement with each other. And AI is a game of patience. You play the long game and you will see results. To wrap it up, finally, 3 mantras again: simplify, fail and fail fast, and there is a goodness factor that the board and the CEO can absolutely play a role in identifying and portraying that to the company. I will stop sharing and I will pause here to take any questions that folks have.
Thank you, Mahesh. Insightful talk. I'm seeing some great comments from people. I really liked your 3 mantras, as well as that hippo comment. Don't listen to always the highest paid board member. That really. So sometimes there is always a challenge. We have seen and heard that if you want, like, to show profit, like bottom line for the company, you have to listen to, like, the investors, the board members, even if it, like, and especially with ethics, because we are running an ethics conference. I would love to ask your take on, sometimes if you see that there is a conflict and some people want to choose profits over ethics, and they are at a higher position, how do you get the stakeholders on board to see what you are seeing?
Certainly. So I'll break this into two parts. I think you have two questions there. One is about the short-term profitability aspect, and the other one is the data and the ethics. So the first one is, yes, there is always going to be the shareholders who want quarterly growth. They want to see the company's trajectory, and they actually hold the C-suite accountable to deliver on those results. And yes, you have a quarterly call on Wall Street, and you have to tell the shareholders how we did in the prior quarter, provide the forward-looking guidance. Even in the middle of COVID, some companies had to do it, and they provided that when they had no idea. But fortunately, most tech companies came out strong. When that happens, um, it's interesting, it's good, But then where the CEO and the chief data officer or the chief tech officer have an opportunity is to step back and say, let's step back and look at next year second quarter. We are in this year second quarter. Let's look at next year second quarter, or let's look at 2 years out second quarter. And
Okay.
in that quarter, if we had to deliver an impact, we have to start now sowing the seeds. So AI is like sowing the seeds. For a company like John Deere that I just shared, it has been a multi-year journey. They had excellent equipment, farm equipment, but they did not even have data stack. Forget the IoT sensors. They had nothing. It has been a multi-year journey. So yes, there was an automation ask, and the stakeholders and the shareholders knew about it. But then there were conversations, and there are similar, dynamics involved where you educate your shareholders to say, these are the initiatives that we started last year, which are starting to show results here,
Mm.
and these are the initiatives that we are doing now with AI. They'll start to show results either next year this time, or 2 years out, or 3 years out. However, here are the interim milestones that we will share with you. It will not directly relate itself to revenue or to cost savings immediately, but there is a path to it. You also have to combine that by saying, if we do not do it, here's
Mm.
the opportunity cost. If we don't do it, we might lose market share. If we don't do it, our costs will double. If we don't do it, we will not have a lead position for this product. So you got to explain that as well. That's when folks get a good understanding. um, the other question that you asked about being ethical about data and how sometimes that becomes important. So yes, I think it's a combination of large tech companies as well as governments who need to come together to create an ethical framework. Some companies have already started to work with the government, and the governments are now involved. But
Mm.
when it comes to global companies, these lines sometimes get crossed. And
Mm.
in this environment, something that the board and the C-suite can do is, how I talked about, understand what data is being captured in the product journey or life or the customer life cycle, and why. You can ask questions, and that's where the data and AI council on the board can add a lot of value by asking, why do we need to store this data? Why do we need to mine this data? How exactly is this data going to be used? Because you could have so much data, end of the day, it'll just be sitting on some location, and you're going to obviously spend a lot on storage costs. It's no use. But at the same time, if you find out like some information which is not even safe or secure for us to gather, if this is not the right place. Let's take an example. A company was trying to gather social security information, but quite honestly, it was not even in fintech. It had nothing to do with social. So yes, those companies get asked the questions, and those are the right questions to ask. What are you going to do with the data, and
Mm.
what is your storage policy? How long do you need this on in the cloud before you delete it? So having some of those guardrails help, but high level, I'm hoping some of the large tech giants in US, along with the government, make a concrete framework, then which then sets the guardrails for how the corporate governance and the AI committees can work and bring that practice both in large tech corporations, PE backed companies, and also in startups.
Thank you, Mahesh. I think you nailed it. Like two key points that I heard from what you suggested. One is to bring stakeholders on board. You have to show them baby steps and the pathway. And even if it is 2 years from now, and same with ethics, that in the short run, it may look like the path to ethics is not helping the bottom line. But like you suggested, right? Our customers won't trust us. Our customers won't do business with us. That's a business impact. And if we are able to translate that, communicate that to all the stakeholders, including the C-suite and the board, then they will be on board with what we are trying to do, right? And then the other thing that you mentioned also made a lot of sense, that asking the right questions. Instead of making assumptions, ask questions. Have a sunset policy to the data that you're collecting. Have a centralized place. I know governance and compliance is important, and yes, that will take a long time. But in the meantime, each of us can do our own part, as employees, as C-suite leaders, as leaders of the tech world, to do the right thing, ask the right questions, and then hope that our journey to AI as well as adoption in data and all of that good stuff is translated into real bottom line profits, but in the most ethical way possible.
Yes, it's a balancing act. You definitely want to do the right thing with the data and with the technology, but at the same time, you want to protect any abuse. And again, you have to have the frameworks in place, you have to have the guardrails in place, and you need these committees. You know how you cannot file if you're a public company, you can't file unless the audit committee stamps on it. So
Sure.
in the data and AI world, you got to have that kind of a similar process.
Mm.
And the audit committee has evolved because of certain instances in
Yes.
this situation also. Hopefully we won't have to go through such big instances or fallouts, but we need that evolution to happen. And the more mature a company gets, the better it is for them to have that guardrail, because it can also prevent their brand from being damaged. Because any of this happening, any leak that happens, take the case of Wells Fargo, when everything that we learned about what happened there, it's a big issue to the brand and to the trust and to the safety. So those things start to play an important role for these large brands. But again, for smaller, more nimbler companies, it's very easy for them to adapt those early in their journey, so that as they evolve, their
Mm.
practices, their framework has evolved. And once again, there is no right or wrong answer. Where we when we are in the flow of things, we just feel like we need this for business. But then having a committee, having a regulation, having a framework can help bring that rich perspective early on, and which can prevent you from just making decisions which might not be the best for your customers and stakeholders.
In the short term, yes, and in the long term. And stepping back from it all to take a look at the aerial view at the bigger picture of the business and where we want to go helps a lot. Thank you, Mahesh. This has been one very interesting conversation. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Up next, we have Golda Velez. Golda Velez is a senior software engineer in risk. I love her title, senior software engineer in risk, Caltech graduate, and human rights advocate. And I know she's so much more than that, what she has, briefly mentioned here. I'll invite her to stay.
Hi, Shruti.
Hi, Gulda. How are you? I love your very brief introduction. I know you are so experienced and you've done so much work, and you are a leader in your own way in technology. And you have some very interesting talk today that you are going to share with us. So I'm really excited.
Thank you, Shruti. I hope so. It's going to be more bottom up. It's not going to be rigorous scientific because I didn't have time to do a scientific experiment based on the proposals I have. But yeah, let's jump into it. I will share my screen
Sure.
and let's see if that works. Okay. If I have to run to my second monitor, I will do that. Now I have the single monitor.
I can see it. Yeah, here.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to go ahead and present this. And can you see all right?
Yes, we can. I'm going to
Okay.
go backstage, Golda. All the best.
Okay, thank you so much, Sophie. All right. So I want you guys who are listening to be ready to take a little bit of a different mindset. I'm going to shift your framework just a little bit, because a lot of times when we're talking about ethics and AI, we're really thinking of ourselves. And most of us who are high-end executives or software engineers in US and European countries, we have a certain life that we live and certain pressures that are on us and certain considerations we have. But I want you to think a little bit about being connected in this larger world where actually a very large number of people in the world that is not their situation. They may have similar skills, but they are actually in a world where they're subject to arbitrary violence. And that's true in many places in the Middle East. It's true in places in China. It's true in places in Russia. It's true in places in Africa, in South America, and in some cases in some of the countries that we think of as the developed world, there's actually some instances of this. But mainly I'm talking about places where everybody knows that you can get hurt if you are caught saying the wrong things. And there's a lot of those places in the world. We are all connected. So the other shift I'm asking you to take is from, oh, I'm reading the news. Oh boy, that happened over there. That has nothing to do with me. Well, it has to do with me. I work at Uber. One of our board members happens to be a fellow who happens to be a Saudi guy who happens to be connected to some people who he could have a very strong influence on some of the things in the Middle East if he wants to. And I am taking that money. So I am connected to that. I think a lot of us are more connected than we like to think about. But how does this relate to AI? And this is why I said sources of truth. So if we want to take AI and try to solve ethical problems, what are the ethical problems we want to solve? How do you make models? How do you make reusable sources of truth to train those models? Because everyone who does AI, you know that the source of truth means that's the thing your model is trying to produce. You have a training set. Where do we get that training set for this kind of serious problem? And just kind of looking at the bigger picture of the problem, what problem am I talking about? I'm talking about the problem that disinformation defends violent acts. I'm going to make the hypothesis, as we're talking about hypotheses, that entities that commit violent acts, not through a justice system, but just arbitrarily, also tend to lie about them. And they tend to smear the victims of those acts. They tend to create a story that defends their acts, which may be provably not true. And they then promote that story on social media, and they have a lot of financial resources to cause that story to be promoted. So that's what I'm talking about combating, is the use of entities that have large amounts of financial resources to defend their violent acts by disinformation campaigns. So I feel that AI can be used for that. Now, sometimes you have, when you think of AI's use in social networking, you might think of things like Facebook, where we're flagging hate speech, where we're flagging those things. And sometimes it's individual hate speech, but often it's actually troll farms and coordinated campaigns. And of course, there's a consideration for free speech. You can't just tell people they can't say mean things, because they can say mean things. But you have these kind of things that have happened that were, in some cases, demonstrably supported by heavily financed disinformation campaigns. And you can measure coordinated inauthentic behavior. That's something that can be analyzed. You have all these different sites. This is a particular one which was in the Middle East. But it's demonstrably a cluster of coordinated posts and releases about a particular subject. So this can be measured, and those posts can be taken down. And so a lot of places, Twitter, Facebook, they do have algorithmic methods of finding coordinated inauthentic behavior. But because this is just an algorithm, they tend to be careful when you penalize it. Whenever you're trying to set up a fraud response or a risk response, you have to be careful for false positives. So you have to prioritize what you're going to penalize. You can't just strongly penalize everything that looks like inauthentic behavior, because at some point you're going to catch real users who are just trying to tell their friends things. So you have to kind of be able to prioritize those, and that's what we're going to get into. Also, I want to emphasize that I've spoken to people who work at Twitter and work at Facebook in these areas, and they have told me that without humans, without the human operators finding those sources of truth, they would fall down in a couple days and just be overrun by spam. So we're still really dependent on human judgment for the source of truth for many things. The coordinated campaigns can be detected algorithmically, but we're really dependent on human judgment to create the source of truth for the models to ban the disinformation. Now, those human operators are low-paid people, maybe in the Philippines, who are scanning through all these violent images using some heuristics. And, that's what we have. That's our defense. But there's other things. Okay, so that's what I was also going to talk about here, is that we have all these kind of human operators quickly scanning through. It works pretty well against spam, because the incentives to spam are financial. And so you can kind of combat them either in a blockchain kind of way or just pretty simply. But if the incentive for the disinformation is outside the network, and it's not just financial, it's a dictator who's in control of a lot of money, doesn't want to have something exposed that he did, and he's going to use all his resources to prevent it from being exposed. There's kind of overwhelming financial resources being set on the disinformation side of the equation. And then we have, these people trying to find it based on some criteria, and they're scanning through all this violent and, explicit sort of stuff, and they have to be clicking on it all the time. So that's one method that's being used right now. There's something else that's happening that I think is not being tapped into. And what that is that there are already organizations that are what I call high lift. They depend on their credibility. The value of these organizations relies on their credibility. They are very careful before they accept cases. I know this because I've spoken to family members of a guy who was kidnapped, and I asked the Committee to Protect Journalists, will you add him to your cases? And they're like, well, we can't add him unless you translate everything he ever wrote and we make sure he's not a terrorist. So they really spend a very, very high lift before they will assert this guy was kidnapped extrajudicially, and it's an injustice that he was kidnapped by his government. And they really have a high lift before they take on that case. So there's this high effort being done. Bellingcat has these volunteers that are really spending more time than the other human operators being hired by Twitter and Facebook, carefully, logically analyzing photos. Places like the New York Times and Washington Post, these people spend a tremendous amount of effort, and we are not capturing that effort into the sources of truth, except sometimes through the human operators who might look it up on these sites. But isn't there an automated way that we could capture this stream of high lift, high effort, kind of anchored assertions that we could then use to prioritize our models and the actions of our models? So that's really my question. Can we, if we set a clear goal, and our clear goal would we want to reduce disinformation that leads to violence. So we have to have a way of measuring that, or that's associated with violence. And can we use these highly credible sources to maybe increase the penalties? So we're not just saying, oh, here's some coordinated actions that happened, but it was all just to sell potato chips. So, who cares? Here's a coordinated action that happened to smear the wife of a murdered person. And let's prioritize that one. And on that one, let's have a higher penalty that we can do to those devices and those accounts, because they not only undertook a coordinated action, they undertook a harmful coordinated action. And so we are willing to set a lower bar, or a higher bar, as you will, a higher penalty and a lower bar for the penalty, because they were so harmful. We're willing to risk more false positives to eliminate this network that was extremely harmful, as opposed to the one that was trying to sell potato chips, which we might let it sneak through. So how do we do it? I'm an engineer, but I'm not saying this is a finalized thing. I just wanted to put something out there so it could be iterated on. You have to have some kind of machine parsable format. You have to have signing and credibility staking, because you can be guaranteed that the bad actors will attempt to put assertions into your chain of assertions. They will try to influence it. So you have to have credibility staking by whoever is allowed to include reputation assertions. And you have to be able to either have a trust web where we assign credibility for good reasons, have a way for people to lose credibility, because you have to really keep that a clean schema, and it could propagate from those trusted organizations like CPJ, like Bellingcat, that are already doing the high lift. I'm going to say, I trust them and I trust what they say. Maybe we can even pay them for it. And we have to be able to talk about entities. So there's a couple of challenges here, but I think that we could do some of it quite simply. So here's like a simple format. Here's some subject that we're talking about. Here's some assertion. We'll have some qualifiers, and here's who said it. And I would like, in the real world, we recognize the difference between me saying, I saw this with my own eyes. I was there. I saw a policeman grab her by her hair and pull her down. I can say, I spoke to the sister of someone who was kidnapped, and she says he's gone. And she says that she can't reach him. So I spoke to her. I might speak to someone whose name I cannot reveal because they would be in danger, but I can assert, I can stake my credibility that I spoke to them. Sometimes there's been a thorough investigation. Sometimes you read an article and you're simply sourcing from an article, and sometimes it's just your opinion. And I think we need to distinguish between those things and create some kind of UX that allows people to easily make these rich assertions and not just click like, thumbs up, thumbs down. It's kind of like that reporting interface that we get. But I think that these things are so valuable in the real world, and yet we have no UX to capture these richer assertions. It strikes me that there must be some low-hanging fruit left on the table here that, well, I guess it's not on the table if it's hanging, but there's something that we're not using in our models, because this is what happens in the real world. We investigate things. So here's some sample assertions. I pulled this from CPJ, and you might just be using a string. You might, be better if it was an entity, but a string is somewhat useful because the strings are what you're going to find on social media. You're not always going to find social media referring to the entity. They're just going to use the string. So here's like the verb, here's how we know about it, and here's who. And then here's one, there's two of them. So CPJ did do an investigation, says he was kidnapped. I also talked to someone who said he was kidnapped, who knew him, who talked to people who do it. So I have secondhand information, and they have. And so you can then roll these up and give different levels of credibility. Now, how does this relate to the automated bot networks? One thing that happens quite frequently is you can use negative sentiment analysis to see when an automated bot network is creating negative sentiment towards someone who was extrajudicially harmed. So there was a smear campaign against Jamal Khashoggi. They said he was a terrorist, and if he was a terrorist, you should bring him to trial, not kill him in some hidden way. So if there's a smear campaign against someone who was also harmed in an extrajudicial manner, I think that it's legitimate to back propagate and say whoever is coordinating a smear campaign against someone who was imprisoned without a trial, that's a problem. And we should be able to eliminate that without being so afraid of the freedom of speech, because it's associated with harm. It's not just that we're saying, this guy's saying dumb things. It's that we're saying bad things about him, and also we kidnapped him. That's a different thing. So you could use, something like Bot Slayer to find the coordinated disinformation, use sentiment analysis, and then associate it with those assertions. So it's a little bit of a heavy lift, but I think it's quite doable. I think it's important enough that it should be done. There would also be other uses of a reputation feed. This is a proposal I made in the Twitter Blue Sky project. It's actually in a different order, so don't get confused. Here, the user ID is first. And these are more granular assertions. Maybe here's a journalist who says, this photo, I took it. Here's some other guy who also says he took that photo. How do we know which one's which? And this guy says that guy did it. But maybe if we trust Bellingcat, and Bellingcat says that this photo was doctored, I'm sorry, he said he took a different photo. Then if we trust Bellingcat, we could propagate the trust and then have low credibility for this guy who's associated with the photo that Bellingcat said was doctored. So these things would be higher lift. I know they may be harder to scale, but I think if we allow a UX with somewhat rich assertions, we'd get a lot of data, because there are people who have a stake in asserting those things. And for example, the Bellingcat volunteers do a lot of granular assertions all the time, but it just comes out as human readable text. And if we could get that into machine readable assertions, I think that's just a really valuable data source that's being left on the table. And so really what I want to say is that, we may not have the full solution, but we have to be working on the right problem. And I know privacy is important. I know other things are important, but she's dead. He is up for 20 years. He was a Twitter, he had a blog on Twitter with a lot of followers, and they hired someone at Twitter to find his IP address and his location and dragged him away. His name's Abdurrahman Al-Sadan. This is Tawfiq. He spoke up for his friend who had been kidnapped, and the next day he was kidnapped. That was a little over a year ago. He's still gone. He's in Iraq. And actually, this woman, I actually forgot her name, but she's in Russia. She is a journalist who was also killed. So we're not really making a systematic effort to stop this. There's news articles and everybody goes on with their day, but we're not going to a system of experimentation and outcome measurement to stop this from happening, and I think we should. So thank you very much for listening. I would love to take some questions. I have a lot of anecdotal things I could share with you, and I would just love to, to chat a little bit.
Hi, Golda. Great talk. I know we have some great comments here. So what data, let me show this. What data do you input in your first training model?
Right. So I think that you have to first allow for these granular assertions to be made. And then I think you have to allow entities from trusted, that you have to decide on an initial trust, that you decide maybe there's, and that's a really good question. I see someone saying, how do you measure trust? I think that you have to initially, have people talk about it. I think that having that initial conversation of who's trusted is an important conversation to have. And I think that there should be consensus that these organizations, which are trusted by our government, by the United States government, they're trusted by the United Nations, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Human Rights Watch. There is some disagreement on that. There is always a political consideration, but I think that there's certainly Snopes. You can name maybe 8 or 10 organizations that are high trust and assign a certain initial trust to those that's high. And then you can include things like Kleros, which has a human jury on is this human? And if you allow a lot of granular assertions, I think that you are going to get things that are provably wrong. A person will assert that they are human when they are not. A person will assert that they are in the United States when they are not in the United States. And some of those things could be tested in a granular way, and you can back propagate the errors. So I don't say that I have the entire model completely sketched out, but I think we need the rich data source, and we need to recognize that there's credibility staking. We can have initial credibility, and there has to be a way to adjust that, and that we need to start those models.
And I also liked your thought on credibility staking from the number of degrees apart, right? If it's the first person who has direct experience versus a third degree apart who's just read it in the news versus a second person, like you got the news from the sister whose brother was kidnapped, right? So I mean, it would be hard to put those kind of, it makes sense. And I can see some challenges in how if we created a public network like that, how we would put weights and parameters on those weights.
You have to separate your concerns. There's the assertions, which is your raw data. And the raw data is that I say that I heard this secondhand. Someone says there was an investigation. So that's your raw data. And then you can have different models that put different weights, and you can start testing them with their outcomes. But you have to have the rich data for them to model on.
Right. And that brings us to the point, if people are honest and when they are saying that this is what I heard from someone. Nowadays, people share information as if they have first-hand information on it, as if they are the authority on it. So it's very hard to understand if this is a hearsay or is this coming firsthand. I want to take.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
You can actually, you could have a view that depends on my point of view. I could say I trust CPJ, and anything that they, say I want propagated strongly to me. So I could say, in anybody that they trust, I also trust. And you could have a trust web. And so then the people who are kind of trolls are not really going to be connected in that trust web. They're going to be in their own bubble of trolls that trust each other. So I think you can address it.
This might be easier for organizations than for individuals. I feel like organizations over time can be trustworthy and we can give them extra weightage that they are trustworthy. For individuals, it might be a little harder to implement, but certainly something to consider. And there are just so many questions.
That's great.
George has another question. When we talk about long-term democracy infrastructure, facts, science, evidence, and the dissemination of such must be funded. It cannot be a ragtag group of volunteers. If we aspire towards democracy, we must make long-term infrastructure investments.
Yeah.
That is true.
I would definitely agree with that. I think we're getting somewhere. Oh, did George want to speak? We're getting somewhere with like the DAO model of voting on using funds. I think that's positive. I think that there needs to be a little bit more delegation and a little bit more conversations in the DAO models, but I think that they're a good start to having democratic control over funds that maybe could be directed towards that. I would definitely like to see governmental support of those. You have to be careful with organizations because they can be body snatched. Organizations can live longer than people, but they can be taken over and switched. So you have to make sure that the organizations themselves have an infrastructure that's not easy to simply take over by somebody purchasing the organization or buying a few board seats.
Rakesh here says always showing information lineage might be an easier way to have.
Absolutely. Sometimes it has to stop with a secondhand reporter because I can't say who told me, but I am willing to stake my credibility on it. And if someone proves it's wrong, you should lower my credibility.
Munish says, however, if the information is coming from reliable sources and then corrected based on what we knew then versus what we know now, then they lose credibility.
I mean, it depends what they assert. If I'm asserting that somebody was murdered and they are alive, I think I should lose credibility because I was wrong. It depends on what you're asserting. You should be careful to assert only things that you actually know or that you've investigated.
George says, I would use historical models to predict the probability of trusted information, data not perfect, but based upon prior experience with source.
Yeah, and I think that if you use them over time, you'd build up more of that historical data that you could use in a machine parsable way. Initially, you have to use human experience because we don't have it machine parsed.
So I know that, Golda, you said that this is not a fleshed out model. This is something that you are thinking about and doing, and I would love to get you more involved. We have an active community, and I know you work with Blue Sky and you work with a lot of other organizations as well. I would love to continue the conversation and see how we can actually build something.
Sure. I mean, if there's a team that wants to do it, I'd be happy to advise people, make suggestions and mentor and bring them developers. And I want to just mention really quickly, I have 1 minute left. Making direct contacts with people is so valuable. And there are developers in Myanmar, there's developers in Afghanistan that we actually can hire. There's women in Afghanistan who I have about the CVs of about 20 or 30 women in Afghanistan right now who need remote work, who are attorneys and civil rights workers who could maybe do some of this work. And they don't need a lot of money, but they need jobs quite badly. So if there's any funding, if you have $1,000, you can actually hire 10 people and transform the life of 10 women in Afghanistan right now. And I'm in touch with them. We actually have a Slack group. And there's just so much that you can do when you get in direct touch with people. And sure, I would love to participate.
Yes, absolutely. I'll be in touch, Golda. We would love to, Data Ethics for All would love to be a part of something like this and bring up a project that helps and makes an impact globally. So I'll talk to you later. Thank you so much for this talk. Very informative. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Next up, we have a panel discussion. Should be a fiery one. Bias in AI is what everybody is talking about, but how realistic are the mitigation strategies of today? We have a very diverse perspective on the panels. From the panelists, we have an actual professor, Professor Michael Whitbrook from University of Auckland, and Rolka Kristen, who is the CTO and co-founder of Ethic AI, moderated by our very own leadership panel, council, Susanna Raj. And I'm going to welcome everyone and bring you all on stage.
Good morning, everybody.
Hi, Michael. Good morning. Hey, Rolka.
Hi. Hi, Susanna. Hi, Sue. Hi, Michael. How are you?
Good.
Hi, Michael. Hi, Rolka. Hi, Michael.
Are you excited about this discussion?
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. All right, Susanna, lead it.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me on this panel. Today, we are going to discuss about bias mitigation strategies that are being used today and how effective they really are. I'm excited to have an academic perspective on this as well as a business perspective from Raluka, who is the co-founder and CTO of Ethic AI, and Michael, who is from the University of Auckland. I just want to start this with a very basic question, because bias means different things to different people who come from different backgrounds. It means it has a totally different meaning for me as a social science researcher. So I want to start with that basic question. What does bias mean to you? When you hear the word bias, what does it mean to you? Any one of you can go first.
I guess I'll go first. So I think it means at least two completely different things. And I think this makes it difficult when it's used, right? It can just mean the predisposition in data or in some acting system to act in a particular way, right? So that the data suggests some sort of action, or they suggest some sort of categories that cause the system to behave in a particular way, and that's kind of built into the way the system's produced. Or it can mean the sort of invidious predispositions that some human beings have, which cause them to behave in ways that we would think are undesirable or even evil, right? And these these two things are not exactly the same, but they are used interchangeably and not to our benefit, I think.
Yes, true. And Raluca, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So I guess when within the context of, I guess, my work and just the IT company, the thing we're kind of referring to is one of those things that it's kind of easy to recognize when you see it, but a little bit hard to define in a kind of standardized way, let's say. So it's basically an outcome of an automated decision system, which is somehow obviously unfair when you kind of think about it. It could be that maybe an overall system performs much worse from an accuracy point of view for a certain group. So it just doesn't seem to work for that group. That's something that we can, if we see it, we say, oh yeah, that's a problem, that's unfair. Or it could be that you have two individuals and they're kind of very similar in all aspects we'd consider important for, getting a loan or whatever, getting a job, but maybe they're different gender or something we don't consider important as humans. And then the system kind of comes up with, a biased decision, something we recognize, oh, it's unfair. Like those people should have the same decision, but they're not, so it's, hard to define, but we kind of can recognize it in its output.
And I do think we are all born with our own biases. We have evolved with our own biases. Some of them have protected us, some of them I think we need to get rid of soon, but we are a work in progress, right? So the biases are embedded in our data itself, right? So,
and one of the things which is very interesting about the source of this debate is that as we build systems with the data that human beings have produced, right, they make those biases, whether they're good or bad biases, manifest, right? They allow us to experiment on those biases, right? It's not that the algorithms. So I have got a little bit of a problem with this use of the word algorithmic bias, right? It's not that the algorithms have biases, right? It's the data that maybe the people applying the algorithms have biases. Occasionally, right? It's at least logically possible that the algorithms have biases based on the way they develop, but that's almost never what people are talking about. It's the data has been selected that is representative of a human group, and possibly all of the humans over some time period, right? And that the decisions now that these systems make reflect those biases and make it clear to us, for example, that in our literature, right, we are teaching ourselves with our literature to have biases which might well be expected to cause humans to discriminate against women, for example. Right, and by having computers do this, we can point the finger at them and say, like, bad computer, knowing, I hope, full well that it means that we're bad people too.
Yes, I do agree, and there is this interesting debate going on whether the algorithmic bias starts in the algorithm, or it starts in the people, or it starts in the data. I feel like that's like a chicken and egg discussion that we will continuously have forever. So what do you think, Raluca, on that note? Before we move on to the question.
So first, just for sure, there's this kind of approach, let's say, or mindset that it is about the data. And as I said, yeah, for sure, it's definitely a big part of the way things get decided. So, and it's reflecting our biases and so forth. But it can happen like across a variety of things. So, for instance, maybe like as humans, we make some decisions which are biased based on characteristics which are biased. But as an algorithm, I might just be picking up a proxy in a way, right? So it's not something that maybe as a human I would ever recognize to be associated with a certain demographic group, but maybe the algorithm somehow recognizes it, and part of the algorithm using that feature is, maybe it has some real explanatory power beyond the bias, but part of it is the bias. And then which one is which is very hard. It's a very tricky problem to assess. So yes, it's the data for sure, but it's also maybe the nature of the system that is discovering patterns in the data, and then how we interact with that system and how we kind of try to shape it and control it a little bit, so that, you know, if we don't want to do certain things, we can affect that essentially.
And I think kind of the fundamental difference there, when you say that a human being would never consider doing this, well, there's always like, one always speaks too soon on these matters. Like, human beings can be quite awful, but to the extent that human beings wouldn't manifest the data, the biases, the negative biases in the data that they're learning from. To the extent that's true, it's because we have access to a kind of data that these systems don't have. And ironically, we have access to a source of inductive bias, which these systems don't have, and that source is knowledge, right? Why do we know? Why can we look at the same data? About job outcomes for women or job roles for women, right? Why can we read the same data that GPT-3 reads, right, about suitable jobs for women and men, right, and not reliably produce the same predictions, right? Which across many languages, the same predictions that the engineers will be male and nurses will be female. The data causes that to happen if you make a naive language model, right? Why do we know better than to exhibit those biases, right? We know better because we know better. So we have a piece of knowledge which tells us that we should disregard that sort of information, right, in many decisions, because it will cause unjust actions. And as we move towards computers having access to that kind of knowledge, right, I think that the likelihood is really that quite soon we will be less likely to have decisions based on invidious biases from machines than from people, right? So I think a lot of the problem we're having not all of it, but a lot of the kinds of problems we're having at the moment are very temporary, and they're because of a weakness in our AI systems, and namely the weakness in their inability to use not just data but knowledge. So that was a little bit long-winded, but yeah.
And no, I think this brings up very well into our next question. If you think it is so complex and it's so embedded in the data itself, where do you think, as a solution finder, while we are working on a solution to solve this problem, where do we start then at the development cycle? Where do we start in the AI life cycle? Where do we start this, solving this problem from? Are we starting at the wrong place when we look at only algorithms or, mitigation strategies, or should we actually start at the data collection or the idea conception stage? So where do you think we should start?
Yeah, I can quickly try to. Yeah, definitely as early as possible. But I think it's kind of better to start, I think, with some. Somebody said it's better to start somewhere, right? So I think that would be my first thing. Let's start somewhere, and then we can kind of, at least make some sort of an impact first. But yeah, it's definitely early in the life cycle, and there's just a few things we're noticing from kind of what we're doing. One, it's not about the metrics. We're finding metrics not super helpful. It doesn't seem to be an optimization problem. I think a lot of the literature is heavily kind of around it being an optimization problem, which is natural because this is the world I guess we all live in. But it doesn't follow that the solution can necessarily be solved in this way. So what we're seeing that it's a little bit more effective is like, whether it is at the data or pre-data collection stages or like at the output stage, it's around that kind of interpretability layer, that kind of surfacing issues, and then the human can kind of interact with those issues and in a sense trace them back. But just to give you kind of an example, for instance, when we say like a data collection, like let's say you're a company that targets, a certain demographic group that might or might not be, let's say, white male between 35 and 65, and like, you know, a certain like income bracket, like in a certain US state, right? So it's very hard for you to collect data. I mean, your whole product is optimized for this demographic. So when we talk about data collection, like it can lead a company to start asking kind of uncomfortable questions about what it is they're actually doing as part of their business model. Because if your marketing, if your product is for this, then you will collect a certain kind of data. And, you know, so yeah.
True. And what about you, Michael? What do you think?
Well, I think that one of the things that we are missing is any sort of clear agreement or on what these classes of invidious biases are. And instead, we're sort of, you know, from the point of view of people who are building decision support systems, right? I mean, and we're left with sort of a hodgepodge of ideas from different countries. So, you know, New Zealand, where I am, differs quite strongly from some other, from say the United States, in the extent to which it enforces protections against bias against women or against LGBT people, right? And certainly differs very strongly compared to some other countries. So just, you know, suppose we're trying to build a system which identifies, for example, whether these proxies are being used, right? You know, you could build a system that looks at your data and sees whether the data has features which can be used as proxies for identifying classes, you know, classes such as I don't know, likely vaccination status, right? Right. If so some a health thing which often would be seen as protected, or proxies for things like ethnicity one's self-described gender, right? So classes like that. Suppose you build a system which is trying to say whether there are things which are used as proxies for that. It would be very useful to know what sort of things we should build in sort of required checks for proxies, right? So so it turns out, it seems, based on a probably to be found out to be bogus study, that your astrological sign predicts your vaccination status in the United States. There was a news story about that just today. I hope we find out that that's not true. You know, it was a 46% versus 70%, right? So if it is true, you know, your posterior probability that there's something to astrology would be higher. So one assumes that is not true. Suppose that was true, and you could kind of predict birth month, right, from vaccination status. Should we build into systems attempts to detect that, right? Attempts to predict birth month or the gender, and only if they can't predict that using these sorts of proxies should we allow them to go forward. Only by starting to have a discussion about what the industry standards should be for testing these things, irrespective of what the particular country standards are, will we, I think, be able to make progress using the techniques that we've got available to us at the moment.
Raluca, you know, I would like to say my opinion on this. I think proxies, by their their existence itself, actually stand for societal biases. I mean, all our proxies have a bias built in, and that bias comes from prejudice and historical discriminations are built into those proxies. So that's what I think. So I believe, like, even using a proxy for for crime prevention or for anything else, we have to look at the knowledge behind it. How did we come to know this proxy is a good stand-in for that classifier. So to me, that itself is a dangerous zone to go into. But what do you think, Raluca? You are actually in the industry itself working on solving this problem. So I would like to hear your opinion on using proxies and what I know Michael was saying so far.
Yes, I mean, obviously it's hard to generalize, but I would say that whether intendedly or not, it does happen that people use this. But of course, a proxy is never usually a perfect proxy, right? So it's a very gray area. But if how should I put it? The problem is when people are not even aware, like, or not even looking at this topic at all. I'd say that's like, that's a starting point, like, of a problem. So if they at least have some understanding that their models might impact kind of actual people, like in negative ways, and at least they can start looking at it and treating with a certain degree of caution. I think even before that, there's a step that needs to be undertaken. And to my mind, I'm not sure if this answers your question, but we see a lot of it's something very hard to regulate, right? So first of all, what's the threshold for? How would you define? I mean, there's like million, like a few ways to calculate like basic metrics, just a basic metric, a few ways to calculate. So how it's very hard to regulate as such because you wouldn't be able to define it in a standardized way. But if you look at the data, you look at the model, look at the outcomes, you can kind of pick up if something is wrong. Is, I guess, and you should be looking at this and picking up if it's wrong, right? So this is, I think, the dubious area where I think, and I'm not sure if I'm right, but if the people that are working on this are starting to kind of look into it a little bit more, then they will at least try to manage within their applied use case to make the decision less problematic. But if there's a regulator, so they will be able to, well, actually, income is a proxy for financing. However, I will, it's a kind of general decision that I will use this. But, whether I shop with a certain brand at a certain time of day, maybe that I shouldn't use this as a decision as whether I finance someone or not, because actually it's a proxy for something that maybe can be a demographic group, right? So these are things that happen. There are examples like the example is clearly wrong, but if you don't even look for it, if you don't even look for these instances, then you're never going to find them because you think it's all good. Yeah. So,
but this case with income versus ethnicity or gender, which that's an interesting case because it's it could those could show up as proxies in both directions, right? And yes. The reason they're a proxy is that they're actually causally related, right? People of certain ethnicities or certain genders have lower incomes because of discrimination, right? This isn't an accident. So I'm not. So one could argue, for example, that by removing knowledge of the effect of gender on income, right, from your system, you're in fact likely to be preserving discrimination by causing. This is actually related to the affirmative action question, yes. Right? You're likely to be perpetrating discrimination by removing the system's ability to notice, right, that this income is dependent on gender, right, and therefore should not be allowed to affect the outcome for somebody. Of course, people have wildly different opinions about this, and their opinion varies wildly depending on which groups they're members of or are not members of, and who yes. This discrimination should be mitigated against also varies widely. So yeah. And this is why this is, I mean, it's much easier just to blame the algorithms, right? Right? Yeah.
But not sure if this is at all helpful, but for instance, in a lot of well, not a lot, but some countries, it's not, you can't use the demographic feature in the model itself. So that's for sure. That's the regulator says no for sure, right? So then what people are using a proxy for it, but then the problem is then they get counterfactuals, right? This is what happens. This is what always. So either you have no counterfactuals, but your model is pretty bad for a group, or your model is actually great and you have loads of counterfactuals just moving around and, potentially creating issues. So yeah, I mean, how would someone regulate that or solve for it is kind of
I know some
question mark.
I know.
Susanna, we are almost out of time, and we do have some audience questions we would like to answer.
Sure.
We are a little over time, and I would love to take this question. Bias in data, Rakesh Ranjan says, bias in data, at least system of records, if not the system of engagement, may represent the state of bias and prejudice in our own society. So I'm interested in learning how the panelists' perspective on if mitigating bias in data would really solve the root cause.
Yeah, I mean, I believe it can, to be honest, but not like completely remove it. But I think we started at the point at which, humans were pretty biased. We put these statistics in place to notice that humans are pretty biased. And now we're like, oh, the statistics, we'll create the statistics more complicated. Now it's like they're, like now we notice bias, but it's kind of reverting back to, oh, let's just leave the human with bias. It's probably not the way to go. So, there's potential for this to make a difference for the good overall, maybe.
Yeah, I think it can certainly mitigate the root cause, if nothing else, by allowing us to build systems which can point out the effect, the causes and the likely effects of human bias, as well as bias in the systems built from human-derived data.
So Susanna, let's wrap it up with one more question, and then let's wrap it up, okay?
Yeah, sure. I would love to hear. I know Michael is a professor and who is, very much interested in building systems of knowledge as a way of mitigating bias. So I would like you to elaborate a little bit on that, because that seems to go back into the foundational models of AI and looking at, whether we can use knowledge as a whole, or or as, as Raluca pointed out, there are proxies. And then I also wanted to jump in and say that we actually used another proxy for income, which we thought was, marital status and education level as a proxy, but even that led into problems. So where do we cannot even start with proxies anymore, but how do we start with knowledge as a database instead of looking as data?
Yeah. So knowing that something is a proxy for something else, right? And that we can therefore try to build models, causally informed models, which mitigate those biases, right? That is a kind of knowledge, that's a kind of knowledge. What goes into these knowledge structure, what things, we have to be able to use these features because we can't build mitigation systems without them, right? If you can't know that your system will use income as a proxy for gender, for example, right? Then it's impossible to mitigate that effect, right? Because you can't build a causal model which supports the calculation. If you do know that, right? If you do have that knowledge explicitly, and we can automate the process of building that knowledge into our systems, I think we have a chance of greatly reducing the cost of mitigation. If we've got systems which actually use causal inference to find out what things are possible proxies, right, and turn them into knowledge, then we have a likelihood of being able to build systems which are far better at this than we humans are. And I think that's a very hopeful point of view. And there is a movement at the moment from being data-centric to being data and knowledge-centric. People have been saying that data is the new oil, and I'd say that that's exactly right, right? And it's something that you use when you're a lot when your technology is primitive, but it's not really all that good for the world, right? And that knowledge-based systems are the new wind and solar, and we should move towards them as soon as possible. And particularly systems which have explicit knowledge about what the right thing to do is.
Awesome. Do you have any final thoughts on that, Raluca, before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, causality is a great area. Yeah, we'd love to see more industry kind of looking at it in a serious way. Like, not necessarily, I mean, people are looking at it in a very serious way, but I mean, kind of looking at it more for these purposes. But yeah, what else? Definitely, I think, while, you know, we have a more practical approach, it's kind of the people that build the system that are super important, right? So, not because they're the only important ones. I mean, it'd be great to get the consumer somehow to contribute to the systems, but I mean, we're not kind of there yet. But, you know, if we get, people want to build better systems, like, especially like people who build stuff, they want to build better stuff, right? So that's not a problem. So I think it's just a question of giving them some tools, like, you know, research and so forth, that they can actually do that easily, basically.
Thank you, both of you, and I really enjoyed this discussion on, you know, and especially that data is the new oil, or the oil, you know, the new electricity. I think those are all, you know, that actually the answer is in the sentence itself. Like Michael pointed out, we are supposed to use them only for a limited period of time until we find something better, and that better could be a global repository of knowledge, of understanding of cultures and languages and everything together. That is where we need to be moving towards, even though that's a harder problem. But I think the industry as a whole needs to invest in it and move towards that. With that, I would like to wrap up and give the stage back to Shilpi. And thank you both, Michael and Raluca, for coming on the show.
Yeah, no, thank you for having
Thank
us.
you, Raluca.
Thank
That was
you.
very enjoyable.
Thank you, Susanna. Thank you,
Thank you so
Michael.
much.
Thanks, Malka.
Bye.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, audience participation. Thank you, panelists, and thank you, Susanna, for moderating this very difficult and very important conversation. I know this is an ongoing conversation on how to mitigate AI, mitigate the biases in AI, whether it is at the data stage, whether it is at the algorithmic stage, whether we can only learn about the bias once the model has been deployed. All of those are and ongoing conversations, and I think we are just barely scratching the surface of AI today. And with time, our answers to these questions are going to be more insightful. I hope we are able to really figure out how to mitigate bias. We haven't figured out how to mitigate bias in humans. I don't know how much more longer it'll take for us to figure out how to mitigate bias in AI. But like Rolka said, it is a start. We have to start somewhere, and that's what we have to do. So with that, I'm super excited about our next guest and his talk, and about his new social network that he's building as a public utility, which, as you know, with the Facebook whistleblower, everything that is in the news today, I think this is a very relevant talk, and why we need something like this. So let me introduce George. George A. Polisner is the founder of the nonprofit CivicWorks. Prior to founding CivicWorks, George worked in product development, performance engineering, service design, and management at Oracle Corporation. He published his resignation letter from Oracle as a protest when the co-CEO of Oracle joined the Trump administration's transition team. His letter was covered by major news outlets and was viewed over 350,000 times. Please welcome George.
Thanks very much, Shilpi.
Hi,
I appreciate the introduction as well.
I want to start this conversation by asking you about, I can't let you go on to your talk without asking you about this letter of resignation that is so much talked about, right? So you want to give a brief overview to our viewers and audience, and then we'll talk about your social network.
Sure. And there's a funny backstory to it as well. But there was no communication internally at Oracle. And I actually just found out in the news back in, I think it was around the November, December 2016 timeframe that the co-CEO, Safra Katz, she was co-CEO at the time, had joined the Trump transition team and had stated that we're here to help you in any way that we can. And I had very strong concerns, as anyone that saw the letter that was published on LinkedIn knows, because at the same time, the administration was talking about the creation of a Muslim database and other issues that, of course, this audience would be very sensitive to, and I would probably respond in the same way that I did. And so I wrote a very pointed letter. I mean, I recognized too that I was at a point in time in my career where I was able to make that statement. I mean, I'm an old guy. Michael in the last presentation was talking about data as the new oil, and I'm thinking, well, I'm a dinosaur, so that's perfect transition over to my presentation. But in any event, a lot of the things that I pointed out in that letter, I think it was about 2 pages, about my concerns with Oracle, with Safra Katz joining the transition team, and with the kind of future that I thought this country would have in an administration that was making fear and hate, key parts of the platform, lies. And so anyways, when I published that letter, my kids had joined me for winter break, and we were watching on LinkedIn, and I remember seeing, about 1,000 people had seen the letter. And so we were thinking, wow, this is impressive. And within, I think, about a week, it had gone to about 350,000 views, and then had coverage by the New York Times and the Guardian. And so at the same time, I was having great discussions with Golda Velez, whose presentation folks heard a little while ago. And it's very hard to follow Golda because she's brilliant. And I am really deeply grateful and honored for the types of things that she's doing and the impacts that she's having in the area of human rights. But Golda, as well as Adam Lake, and I were having discussions about the potential, what CivWorks would look like, and I'll talk about that a little bit in the presentation.
I'll let you continue, George. Do you have slides to share?
I do. I think I can share my screen. Let's see. Here we go. Let me see if I can do this. And Shilpi, are folks seeing the presentation at this point?
George, I don't see it in the green room yet. Once I see it, I can add it to the stage.
Okay, let me see. So, so choose what to share.
Yeah.
And is that showing up now?
It is showing up now, and you can go in present mode, George.
Oh, very good. Okay. So CivWorks as a social media company, as a public utility. First, a couple of key things. Most slides that you will see in this presentation won't be as text heavy as the next one. And I've consumed copious amounts of coffee. And so don't worry, we're going to get through the next 34 slides rapidly. So there'll be some time for questions. And first off, I wanted to thank you, Shilpi, and the DataEthics4All team for putting this together, and all of you out there that are listening now or may see this presentation later on demand. I wanted to share just a few brief oversimplifications from my long technology career, which is almost 40 years, which also means I'm a very bad investor because most of my friends retired long ago. They got into Unix and the industry when I did. But in terms of my observations, the very first phase of the industry was really a data collection, processing, and storage phase. The second phase was, now that we have some data sets, how do we harvest that data to drive business outcomes or public sector outcomes in the area of sales, profits, record keeping, efficiency. The third phase is the big data advanced analytics and starting to use psychrometrics to track and drive behaviors, whether they be consumer behaviors or political behaviors. And the fourth phase that we're talking about really now is the application of AI to drive outcomes, automation, and the potential that we're seeing to exacerbate inequality by being able to create economic models like things like Uber and others in a gig-based economy where money is really flowing to an investor class in a very concentrated way. And my other observation, again, this is an oversimplification, that ethics in technology has largely long been related to some checkbox data privacy language, usually in a 20-page terms of use. And so, again, the thinking behind data ethics for all and really trying to move ethics into the DNA of the technology space is something that I really applaud and am very grateful for knowing Shilpi and the work that the team is doing. So ethics in social media, we know from Facebook and Twitter and other models that
Sorry, George?
Yes.
Your presentation is not moving forward. Are you moving it forward?
I am, and so let me see. It's moving forward on my screen, and unfortunately, it sounds like it's not moving forward on anyone else's. Let me just see.
Sometimes it does that, and technology.
Yeah.
Can't live with it, can't live without it.
That is true. So I don't know if it's...
Okay, there. Now it is.
Okay.
Now it's moving, George.
Oh,
and
good.
if you want to try the present mode, George, it'll be bigger.
Let's see. Okay.
George, on your right-hand corner of your screen where there is a slider for Zoom, the fourth button is right next to the slider. The left of the slider is a present mode.
Okay. And is that... Okay, good. And hopefully this will update the screen as I move through. So let me know, Shilpi, if this is updating.
It did not go in present mode, and it's not. Can you? I'm not sure. Can you move the slide one up or down? It didn't go in present mode. Let me remove it and add it again. Let's not worry about present mode. George, can you try going up or down the slide?
Sure. Is that updating?
I think it's updating. So
Okay.
then you're good. Yeah.
Very good. So sorry about the eye test, folks. But anyways, I'll talk to these slides and happy to certainly share them with folks that are interested in seeing the actual presentation deck. But anyways, we know that social platforms thrive on conflict and controversy. And we also know that user interactions with the commercial platforms like Facebook, the user interactions are the product. You are essentially the product. So your posts and comments, your profile is really a goldmine for sales and marketing efforts, as well as political operatives that we saw in the 2016 presidential campaign, as well as in Brexit. We know that Facebook was working very closely with Cambridge Analytica. We know that Steve Bannon was very involved in Cambridge Analytica. And I think everyone here knows this story, that there was involvement by a billionaire in the US, Robert Mercer, Steve Bannon, Cambridge, and Facebook. And they were very influential in sending targeted messages based upon psychometric data that they collected on individual users. And they did this to support both Brexit and the Trump administration. And so here we see Robert Mercer working on one side. We know that state actors in Russia, as part of the Robert Mueller investigation, were also working to disseminate propaganda and lies to influence the election in the US, as well as the vote in the UK. We also know that in any kind of publicly traded entity, commercial entity, the thought of data protection represents a cost or an investment that somebody like Facebook or Twitter or any of the commercial entities need to make. And one would ask, if their core mission is not to protect people's data, how much money are they really going to be spending to protect information? And here we see some fairly recent information from another huge data breach at Facebook, and Facebook's response internally was, pretty much ho-hum. That's the way it goes. And so anyways, we know that democracy demands a well-educated, well-informed, and engaged society. And we also know from experience that democracy and the kind of extreme wealth concentration that we see now in the US and around the world simply cannot coexist. You have too much wealth and power concentrated into the hands of a few. And so that certainly makes any aspiration of democracy a very large challenge. It's an impediment. Not that everybody should essentially just be distributed equal amounts of wealth, but certainly not the kind of inequity that exists within the system now that has been colored by generations of bias and racism and misogyny. So CivWorks, I was told not to be political. I hope I'm not being political. CivWorks is a 501c3 nonprofit that we launched back in February of 2017. It was launched fairly quickly after the elections in the US. What we wanted to do is to provide an advertising-free, subscription-based social platform that did not sell any subscriber data or share any data. And we think of ourselves as a long-term countervailing infrastructure to address the Lewis Powell memo. And granted, that's not a good tagline for a business, but just to provide a little context, I'll get into what I mean by that in just a minute. This is a look at the web-based platform for CivWorks. And so it is a social network that's providing an outlet, a mechanism for people to post and perform a lot of your fundamental resources that you would expect from a social media, social network. Obviously, we don't have the kind of funding that a Facebook or Twitter or other model would have as a nonprofit. We rely on really subscribers that want to support us and provide a small monthly recurring donation to support our operations and development. Earlier this year, we launched native iOS and Android versions of CivWorks. And so I was very, very happy to get that done and get that effort funded. It's something that's been on our engineering list for a while. And so we'll continue to make improvements as we can to the web, iOS, and Android areas. Why CivWorks? One, we don't sell or share subscriber data. We're ad-free. It's free to use our platform. although we certainly appreciate when folks that want to chip in a few bucks a month. We think of it as kind of the Netflix for democracy model. We want to gamify civic actions and education. And so when people take an action, when people attend a town hall meeting with a local official or a senator or a congressperson, or where they send a letter to an editor for an issue, other types of civic actions, we want to gamify that because we know hardcore activists are going to do it, and that's great. But we see that there is a massive part of the center, the middle part of any society that really needs to be nurtured and supported in terms of their engagement. And so we seek to provide civic action opportunities for them and to also provide a feedback mechanism for them to continue to support even competitive behavior with regard to taking action. And for our future, we are very anxious to be able to get to the point where we can incorporate some of the ideas that Golda has spoken about earlier and others of you have spoken about in terms of really being anti-propaganda, to be able to have news source ratings and information ratings on the site. We also want to extend to provide information about corporate social behavior, how a company is behaving. Are they mitigating their environmental footprint? Are they providing a equitable salary, fair and embracing fair labor? We want to be able to provide information to people that can either act civically, politically, or economically in terms of how they spend their money or how they invest their money. And we'll also talk a little bit briefly about our future in terms of really trying to facilitate discussions and outcomes among people that may not politically agree. We think that that's very, very important instead of just people shouting at each other, which has become the common method of communication, sadly, in the US and around the world. Just briefly, when I talk about the Lewis Powell memo, we know that in the 1960s, that there were many different entities that really came together and united across traditional lines, whether it be the peace movement, the labor movements, women's rights, civil rights. They came together. They saw that through protest and through marching and through activism, they were really able to make significant gains in the 1960s with regard to civil rights and women's rights and peace and the union strengthening of unions. And what we saw in the 1970s, for folks that haven't read it, it's really important reading in terms of at least US history, because a lot of what we see today in terms of the concentration of wealth, the media propagation of media messages really started with the Lewis Powell memo that he wrote. It's a brilliant memo. It has been used for purposes that really have supported the 1%, the further of wealth concentration in the US and around the world. But it's written very collegially, and it's a very smart architecture for long-term infrastructure for the 1%. And it's been very successfully applied over the last 50 years. And so I encourage everybody that hasn't seen it to look for the memo from August 23rd, 1971. It defined the conservative machine. It talked about the formation of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. Many of you know that this is an entity that is behind a lot of very bad policy and legislation in the US, stand your ground laws, voter suppression, and so-called right to work is all emanated from what Powell wrote about. The emergence of right-wing think tanks, which have led to climate change denial, a lot of propaganda around climate change and the oil companies for generations. Media consolidation. At one point in time, there were about 90 independent media companies, which are now down to, I think, 5 or 6. And tying academic funding, university funding, to conservative representation and propagation of conservative ideas and thought is all part of the Lewis Powell memo. And so from that, we see this. It's the GOP is very connected to ALEC, and a lot of the funding that comes out of the Koch brothers, the Walton family, and others that work to really further laws that will concentrate wealth and exacerbate wealth inequality and climate change denial and privatization and erosion of public schools and universities. And so a lot of propaganda emanated from the evolution of what Lewis Powell wrote about, as well as the distribution of hate and fear-based messaging across various networks, whether they be radio, TV broadcasts, or social media. And wealth inequality, again, it's our fundamental belief that you cannot have massive wealth inequity and support democracy at the same time. You just can't concentrate extreme wealth and power into the hands of a few and expect to have a representative democracy. And this problem, of course, for those that are familiar with the Citizens United versus the FEC decision, it has been exacerbated by that Supreme Court decision. So in countervailing the Powell machine, as I talked about, we want to gather, essentially, we want to provide a social media platform for people to use as they would a conventional social platform, but to also to be able to cultivate virtual flash mobs to help drive policy and action that can provide human rights, civic rights, expand civic rights, address climate, and do other things to support issue-focused campaigns and political advocacy groups. And so in working with organizations like the below, anti-corruption, climate action, racial justice, and other organizations, LGBTQ community, we want to really help drive, resist, first of all, bad policy and legislation, and strategically drive comprehensive good policy where we can, that can strengthen democracy over time.
Two more minutes, George.
Okay, and so 8 slides, that's about 15 seconds a slide. No worries. And so anyways, Golda, Adam, and myself started talking about what can we do about the corrupting influence of money and the demise of democracy. This was coverage from The Guardian on the resignation letter that I wrote back in November, December of 2016. And CivWorks was formed, and we started as a concept. We wanted to be the people's ALEC initially and be an index database of good policy and model law and legislation that people could use. But we determined working directly with legislation and policy is a pretty heavy lift for the average citizen. And we wanted to support sustained and effective civic action. We didn't want to be another site just simply collecting petitions like, hey, Mitch McConnell just sneezed, sign our petition and send us money. We really wanted to have an impact on state, local, regional, national, and even international actions. And so we started to develop mechanisms, and what you probably can't see in this eye chart, but on our site, what we do is we publish actions that people can take that are effective actions either toward civic education or taking direct action, showing up at a local school board candidate debate or showing up at a town hall meeting or other opportunities for action and education for themselves, their families, and communities. And so there it is, looking a little bit bigger. You can see ACT Now is featured. We want to support sustained meaningful civic action. So there's a spectrum of actions which are effective, really a hierarchy of actions that go all the way from going to a town hall meeting to show your interest in political decisions that are being made by elected officials, through letters to the editor, all the way to supporting a run for office, which is a pretty heavy lift from a civic action perspective. We also continue to work on making sure that civic actions have visibility directly to a user or subscriber, something that's happening in their own backyard or at their local library. We want to let them know. And so we do some cross-matching between a subscriber's location, what their issue, interest, or focus is, and the actions that flow through our system. And people register, sign up for free, and they self-identify the issues that are of interest to them. And then our engineering priorities over the next few years, as we can afford to fund them, we've built the native mobile apps. We want to provide the indexed legislative database and model policy and law that people can find and select maybe anti-fracking bills for their counties or local areas. We want to develop a comprehensive education curriculum around effective civic action. And we want to be able to provide news source and journalist trust ratings, even in their infancy. They're very, very important to combat propaganda and issues that we have seen and will continue to see that will evolve very, very quickly and create more of a threat to democracy in the US and around the world. And some other things that we're exploring, such as blockchain and offshoring a subpoena-proof database to protect privacy for our community and enhance security for the site. And marketing priorities are, of course, interesting to us. Facebook often takes care of a lot of our marketing for us because every 2 or 3 months they're in the news doing some pretty bad things, which makes people more interested in our work. And so anyways, I hope this has been useful. And Shilpi, I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any questions folks may have.
Thank you, George. Very interesting talk, and the work that you, Golda and Adam are doing, and the team at CivicWorks. Kudos to you all. Any special questions we have from the audience? So Golda says that I think the payment model for CivicWorks is what makes it have unique drivers.
It's interesting. When we initially started with the platform, we wanted to make it free for students and teachers to use. And we wanted to then have paid subscribers as well. And what we found was putting any kind of economic barrier in place really greatly constrains growth. And so we decided to open the platform up for free for anyone, but then adopt the Guardian type subscription model where folks that really believe in our concept and work can contribute a small recurring monthly donation, which helps us offset our operations costs as well as developing new features and functions as quickly as we can.
Yeah, so I heard that there is a freemium model, but it's not enforced. It's free for all, and anybody. It is a 501c3, and you would like support. And so, if anybody wants to pay and get on the premium model, they can, just for supporting you. So, is there any long-term sustainable plan for this?
There are several that we're exploring, but certainly require us to grow to a certain scale. And one of them that we want to support is folks that interact with social media quite frequently. You might see Governor Kate Brown up in Oregon meeting with first responders and publishing a post on Facebook about wildfire and climate change. And typically there'll be some supportive messages, and then there'll be thousands of derisive messages from people in West Virginia or elsewhere that are not part of her constituency. What we want to do is to incorporate, once we gain a little scale, a model in which elected officials can effectively have rooms that are with their validated constituents, and that they can do direct polling and really conduct virtual town halls as a way to support more participatory democracy. And so that is a model where we would shift a premium subscription option to the elected official or the elected agency or body, which could then really help our growth. And so there is that. We also, as part of that model, are looking to have constituents or our subscribers verify themselves, so verify their physical location. And so we would charge a small annual fee for that. And that, again, would help us generate operational and development revenue. But right now, we are all volunteers, and some of us are really old, so that makes it even worse, Shilpi.
Old is gold, George. And I know that I want to say this publicly. You are so good, and I have had the honor of inviting you to become a DataEthics4All advisor. And I hope that you will consider it and you will accept it. And I'm still waiting on your confirmation. I know verbally you have, but it isn't official yet. So I love everything that you're doing, and I would love to have you on board.
Well, I'm honored, Shilpi, and with witnesses on this call, I will send an email confirmation. But no, I really support the concept, and the ideas are so important to our future. I tend to think of reacting to the fires that are burning out of control right now from a societal and global perspective. And you already are optimistic, thinking that I can solve some of those problems and that we can have a future in which ethics will be incredibly important.
We are all optimistic, George. Who knows where we will go or what we will be able to accomplish. But we have to start somewhere, and that's what all of us are doing. I want to take a question from Rakesh Ranjan. He says, George, your effort in creating an alternative platform to address civic issues is commendable. And you touched upon the elected officials, and he touched upon that exactly. Does this platform take issues with our elected officials? So can we take our grievances to our politicians?
we definitely want to have that dialogue. And another friend of ours who is, I'm a huge fan of hers, is Colleen Hardwick, and she created up in Canada a platform called PlaySpeak, P-L-A-C-E, Speak. And a lot of the concepts in that platform we want to integrate into CivWorks, which will allow that verified constituent dialogue with a public official. And so if I think about the future of CivWorks, I think of perhaps a state legislator up in Oregon talking directly to his district and people that are verified to be part of his district, saying, hey, there's a vote coming up next week on alternative fuels. Here are the issues. Here's what I'm thinking about in terms of voting. What are your thoughts about this? And being able to have votes from the community, because when you think about it, the physical town hall meetings, city council meetings, supervisor meetings, they're typically at night. You get a very small, narrow cross-section of people that can attend those meetings. And so I really would like to open this up to an entire community, people that are working 2 jobs to just be able to pay rent, if they're lucky enough to have jobs, aren't going to be able to go to those meetings, but being able to attend virtually and weigh in on issues, to me, that's what democracy is all about.
I love this, George, because this is truly inclusion, diversity and inclusion in action, right? I mean, it's like people who who we think their voices, like others think their voices are not as important, or they cannot give the time of the day. You're making it accessible, and you're making it, democratizing it to make every voice important and heard. And I love that. So kudos to you and your team, George. And yes, we are already seeing welcome advisor posts on the comments. So you are official, George. Thank you so much for your time today. Great talk, and we'll continue the conversation. Take care.
Thank you very much, Shilpi. Bye, everyone.
All right, next up, we have Dia Win, Senior Practice Manager of AWS. Dia has worked in technology for 25 years, building, delivering, and leading in early and growth stage companies. She has a passion for developing current and emerging leaders, promoting STEM to the underrepresented, and driving diversity, equity, and inclusion. After spending years in technology-focused roles and separately pursuing passion projects in DEI, she now has a role marrying the best of both worlds. She leads a team focused on engaging with customers to go from principles to practice, operationalizing standards for responsible use of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and data. Please welcome Dia Wen. Dia, are you ready? Hi, Dia. I can't hear you, Dia. Oh, you are on mute. Unmute. Hi, Dia.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I am great. I am doing great. I'm excited to be here.
Yes, excited for your talk, how to accelerate AI adoption. I'm going to give you the stage, Dia.
Am I able to share my screen as well?
Yeah, I don't see your presentation, Dia. If you want to share your screen, there's a share screen at the bottom.
And is that happening on my side or no?
I don't see it. Do you see a share screen on your side?
Yeah, I am. It's allowing me to share. But I was just hearing a little echo, so I was wondering if that was on my side or not.
I don't hear any echo, Dia.
Okay, good. See if we can do this.
I'm sure we'll figure it out. Are you able to see the share button on the bottom of your green room?
Yep, I got it. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. As soon as I see it pop up, I'll add it to the stage.
Trying to make sure that it shares the window.
Okay. Yeah, you have to select the right window to share.
All right, we should be good now.
There you are. Do you want to go and present more, Dia?
I would love to do that.
All right. I see a blank screen. Is the first screen blank?
No, it's black though. You should be seeing something that says enabling AI adoption.
I'm not sure. I don't see it. Can the audience, can you move your slides up and down, Dia? Let's see if we can see anything.
I noticed that folks were not doing it in full screen. I wonder if that's why.
Okay. Let's not go to full screen then. Let's see.
Okay.
I mean, we've ran this conference for 2 days now. Today is the third day. It was working, but technology, it just...
Yeah, no worries. I noticed that others were not sharing in full screen. They were just showing part of the slide. So maybe that's the issue
Okay.
as I was watching.
I lost your share screen, Dia. So do you want to share it again so that I can add it to stage? It went away.
Oh, okay. All right.
How's everyone doing? Almost lunchtime. Are you grabbing your lunch while watching Dia's talk? And then there you are.
So are you all seeing it now?
Yes, we are seeing it and it's moving. So you're good, Dia.
Let me do this. I'm going to just close this slide in here.
I'll
So,
go back to Dia.
are you all seeing that more in
Yeah.
a larger screen? Does that work?
That works. Perfect.
Okay, great. I apologize for that brief little technology get together there. So good afternoon, and it is afternoon on the East Coast and the West Coast now, and hopefully others that'll get to see us. This will be greetings to everyone. As was introduced, I'm Dia Nguyen, and I'm excited about having the opportunity to share a little bit today. Now, I would say I have a distinct pleasure in being on the stage with so many other amazing folks that have been talking with you over the last 3 days. But I also have a bit of a challenge because we've had some amazing individuals come, and I think I'm at the end of the day. So, so I just we'll go through this as best as possible. And I'll tell you, I was listening in on one of the talks from yesterday, and it was Vivian, and I loved the way that she started. So I just wanted to take a moment to just share a little something with you, maybe a little bit personal, but hopefully will give a good context for how I got here, and then really why this particular area is important, and of course the work that DataEthics4All is doing as well. So I have 2 boys, and I grew up in a family of girls in the South Bronx and New York, between Harlem and New York City, or New York. And as an earlier in my years, I had not been exposed to technology. I'm saying early in my years, but I'll explain a little bit more. I had not been or had the privilege to see other people who were in technology in my family. So what was traditional at the time was to see women who were teachers, maybe a nurse, and I got a computer early in the 3rd grade. And that actually was the thing, the catalyst for me that made me want to go into technology. It was that exposure. And I bring that up because I think it's so important, the work that DataEthics4All is doing in exposing young people to STEM and technology and opportunities in artificial intelligence, and even exposing and elevating awareness for folks that may not be as aware about some of the challenges and the things that we should be mindful of, or avenues for us to consider as we look to advance technology. And so I just wanted to bring that up because for me, when I start thinking about my earlier experiences, then I was looking at, well, what do I do with my sons? How do I prepare them for what's going to come in the future? And that's really led me to where I am today. My background is in technology. I studied computer science, so I was that 3rd grader that kept my mind focused on technology even from that start. But I wanted to make sure they too had an opportunity to live in this world. Maybe we're talking about free of bias, certainly not free of bias, but being able to navigate, because we know that there may be changes, or there are changes in the way that we would have to live and adjust when we think about technology, artificial intelligence, robots being at the forefront of how we engage and shaping or shifting how we interact with the world. So in my introduction, you heard the mention of taking the best of both worlds. And I say that because this is as much an inclusion, diversity, and equity problem as it is a technology problem. So that's just a little bit of my introduction and why this is so important that we bring awareness and education and opportunity, exposing individuals to more of what the world will look like and the opportunities we have in it. Now, since I'm here on the last day of this AI Diet World, I wanted to just give you briefly an overview of some of the solutions that I and my team and I have created really to help our customers at AWS in this journey to responsible AI. Oh, I need that little one over here, a little bit, just a little. So I don't need to tell you all, or most of you are already aware about or aware of how much machine learning, artificial intelligence has been incorporated into everything that we do. Most of technology or most of our industries are exploring and using artificial intelligence in some ways. I tell the story of just recently buying new appliances in my home, and my Samsung refrigerator and TV and microwave all have ways of talking to each other and giving me alerts in different places. And those are some simple examples, but then we also know that organizations are starting to use it in ways that aren't just research and development anymore or proof of concept projects, but really moving to how they can leverage artificial intelligence in major ways to advance products, to see greater efficiency in operations. And we know that they're handling real world tasks, maybe not as simplistic as my Samsung refrigerator, my kitchen appliances, but more complex problems that we thought perhaps unachievable or unattainable in the past. And this whole idea of this increased use of machine learning and artificial intelligence technologies means that there's an increased need for us to be aware of benefits, potential risks, but also be doing something about them. Now, these two are describing recent studies, and I'm saying recent, there even is a little bit more recent study that's come out that's talking about some of the challenges that enterprises have. And while this says enterprises, it's not just restricted to enterprises alone. Companies, CEOs in the enterprise recognize that there is a potential for bias and lack of transparency. And we're seeing that in other organizations, big and small. At the same time, there is a concern, and this came through in a Gartner study that said that 85% of the projects were expected to deliver erroneous outcomes due to bias in the data, the algorithms, and the teams that produce them. And so what do we do then if we recognize that more companies are going to begin to use artificial intelligence and more applications are going to have AI and ML infused into them, and we're going to be interacting with it more when there are these potential risks? Now, there's another study as well that that was actually talking about, and this one was from Deloitte, that said that while organizations understand that there's a risk or understand that there may be a potential for bias and the lack of transparency, they really don't have the skills in order to be able to address those issues. So there's some level of awareness, and some people will question whether everyone is fully aware of where there may be impact. But then what do we do? Not everyone is sitting in circles or experiences like we just saw the last 3 days, where they're talking about potential opportunities and the ways in which we might look at navigating bias, or how do we understand our data and look at more complete or robust options with our data. Not everyone is sitting in those environments. And so what do you do when there is such great promise and opportunity when we think about the ways in which AI is being used today? We heard some examples, and when Vivian was talking about being able to give those who were autistic the ability to be able to recognize expressions that they wouldn't normally be able to do. Amazing sort of use case, right? Or, in the case of Thorn, which is helping children that may have been pulled into the child sex trafficking, helping them to be reunited with their parents or their families. These are use cases that matter, and we want to be able to have the technology at hand for us, right? So then what do? I think when we think about enterprises and us wanting to be able to leverage the great benefit that we have in the technology, we also need to be making sure that we're not infringing on civil liberties, and that there is inclusive technology or models that are being used in ways that really respect our rights, are fair, and inclusive. Now, in the work that I get to do and my team as well, right, we understand that this is not just a simple problem. And some of the things that we can do may be in fact simple for us to be able to address it, but this really is a multidisciplinary problem, not just looking at the skills or the expertise from certain industries, but also bringing to bear technology and philosophy and law and these other social sciences to begin to be able to address some of the issues, some of the challenges, and create opportunity. I heard someone say that the other day. Consider every problem or every issue as an opportunity, and I think indeed it is when we start looking in this space. So what my team and I got to do is we've created this framework so that we can begin to address the gaps in skills with enterprises and organizations like we were talking about, so that they're not just aware and wondering what to do, but they actually have skill and capability to be able to address that, to address those and begin to tap into how do we operationalize responsible AI? What things did we put in place in order to ensure that we're looking around corners and seeing where we didn't notice that certain individuals may not have been at the table, and this application isn't necessarily meeting the need of some of our consumers. So for us, AWS Ratio is our responsible AI framework that helps us actually move to one, establishing or leveraging principles, tenets, and moving that in ways so that we take intentional and strategic approach so that we can deliver business outcomes and minimize unintended impact and risk. This is our answer for assisting organizations with building on their investment or capitalizing their AI investments in ways that allow us to experience the great benefits that we get in tackling these challenges, but also being conscious and aware and addressing opportunities or areas where there may be risk. Each stage in Ratio helps us highlight questions, primary considerations, areas that we need to pay attention to identify where there are gaps or where there are potential risks, and begin to address those with some best practices and actually doing the work to put them into place in the organization. So we help our customers look at artificial intelligence in the way in which, and machine learning and the way in which they're going to employ that in a responsible way. This for us is identifying a new operating model, right? Looking at people, process, and technology so that we can really drive better outcomes and reduce risk. So defining and executing that operating model goes across every stage of what we would say the machine learning lifecycle, but this is really a part of a holistic AI journey. Do we understand what responsible AI is? Are we informing and educating all the people that might have an impact in the decision-making process, in annotating data, whether that's in our testing, as well as our data scientists that are training models, that all are educated in an area in ways so that they actually can be accountable and responsible, and take a part in ensuring that we're delivering, we're building, we're deploying, and we're operating responsibly. So we've defined 7 pillars as a guide to help us navigate through the areas, again, to put in place the right things in order to design and develop, deploy, and to operate responsibly. And this will hopefully address ethical concerns when we assess this more broadly, and help us define players that have responsibility, and so they have clarity about where they fit and when. And then give us a real true mechanism for being able to monitor and iterate over time, and continuing to improve the process. Because the ultimate goal is that we minimize the risk, reduce unintended impact, and build in an inclusive way. Now, I talked about this, and we started off with this first piece or definition that said scaling adoption of artificial intelligence. And the reason why I say that is because this conversation ends up being one about trust, and we've heard a little bit about that over the course of the last couple of days as well. As human beings, we don't trust things that we don't understand, and companies need to be seen as trustworthy and building trustworthy products. And the absence of that is going to have an impact on the company, people's perception of their products, and technology, the technology itself, which ultimately has an impact on the industry, and will prohibit our ability to, one, leverage it in life-changing sort of solutions or solving problems that may be life-changing, but also it will limit our ability to be able to continue to use it throughout. And so it has an impact on the industry as a whole. So we want organizations to be building responsibly and operating responsibly so that we can continue to solve real world problems and find new, and a great example of that would be like with the NFL and the way in which they're using AI to find new ways to address player safety. I told you the example of Thorn with child sex trafficking, or even Cerna that's using AI in ways to start to predict how they might heart-related issues so that can provide more preventative care. These are the ways in which we want to be able to leverage it. And so we've got to build a foundation of trust. And that premise or that notion has to start not just with the data scientists or those of us that are aware, but really giving opportunity and responsibility to everyone in the life cycle. And that starts in big part with our companies and our organizations that are building and deploying the technology in this way. So with that, I will say thank you, because I only had a little bit of time, but our solutions really go from discovery into production. And these are ways in which our team, which is a global team, can begin to come alongside and partner with our customers and take them along this journey, going through the 7 pillars and really highlighting areas of opportunity for us to address, to really build more inclusively and ultimately have the foundation of trust that allows us to solve more and to address more in the world.
Completely agree with you, Dia. What a fantastic talk. Completely agree that, we have to move forward with social good as our core in order to use and leverage data, technology, artificial intelligence, only to make the world a better place.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Do we have any audience questions? Anything specific for Dia? I guess it's lunchtime and people are hungry, at least on the
I
West
know,
Coast.
give me this hard sort of difficult spot here. So,
I know. I'm sorry. Somebody
well,
has
certainly
been.
if there are questions, folks can reach out on LinkedIn
Yes,
or get connected, and happy to dig into more where we have an opportunity one-on-one, or certainly work with other organizations as well.
yes.
Because this is important to us, and as many have said, we're all, a part of, driving solutions in this space.
Yes, and Dia is also going to be a part of the Data Ethics for All community, and she'll be around. As she said, connect with her on LinkedIn, ask questions, put your questions in the chat, and tag her, tag AIWDW2021, and she'll still be around to answer your questions. Dia, we would continue working together, and thank you for your time.
Yep, looking forward to it. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye. Wow, that wraps up AI Diet World Day 1, Day 2, and Day 3. We have heard from some amazing speakers. Wow, what an amazing lineup of speakers we have had. With the one exception of Alberto Roldan, we could not hear him live. There was some technical difficulty and he could not join us in live stream. But he has a wonderful video that he has prepared for us on AI vibrations, and he's going to share that with us. And besides that, I thank all of our speakers to participate and support us in AI Diet World Champions Day, Career Fair, and Solutions Hack. And I can't wait for this conversation to continue. Please come and join, be a part of our community, be a part and support us in what we are doing, be a part of the vision. And there's just so much to do. And just like George and everyone else here, Dia, George, so many other speakers have said, I want to reiterate that the work is a lot. There is a big work that needs to be done, and it cannot be done without your support. With that, I want to invite people who have registered officially for AI Diet World. Don't forget, there is a backstage after party that starts at 3 p.m. Pacific today, and people who have registered are invited. People who didn't get a chance to register or missed the registration deadline or the window, we will, I'm not sure if we can accommodate you, but hopefully we'll register next time on time, and then we can invite you again. And our work will continue, so please do join us in our town halls, in our community, and other areas of workshops and things that we are doing. Thank you again, everyone. I want to thank my team, my leadership team, Susanna, Kevin, Bruce, Sam. Really couldn't do it without your support. And not everybody is on backstage right now, so I wouldn't invite all of them here, but I know you guys are here and listening. And thank you, everyone. Thank you to our fascinating audience. Great participation. Thank you so much for being there and for supporting us all 3 days of this conference. And it's a wrap, people. See you at 3. Take care. Bye-bye.